Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the Thinklings podcast. This is a wonderful duet between Tim and Charlie. Andy is not here, and I want to remind all of our listeners it's a great time to pray for the Stearns family. And Tim has a little announcement here for us there too.
Yeah, Robin's in hospice now. And so pray for her that there'd be some measure of pain that's relieved and that she can just have a good time with the kids and with Andy. And the president of Faith, Jim Tillotson's created a GoFundMe page. If you'd like to donate to that, I'm sure they'd appreciate it as well. But as Andy has said, even on previous episodes, that life does go on. And we have an episode that we're going to record, and I pray that it's a blessing for you. But as we even go through this episode, just reflect, take a moment, maybe pause the podcast and say a prayer for them. Our friends are hurting. We love them, and we'd appreciate that.
And I guess along that lines, I will throw in an Andy quote. So probably the book that I think about Andy the most, which I am reading again this fall because I like to go through it in the fall, at the start of a school year, and share from it with my students. That is The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertillange. And probably the first time, this might not even have been recorded in an episode, but it was one of our earlier meetings where he had been reading that.
Yeah, Andy was the one that put us onto that book, and we were reading it together before we had a podcast.
Well, and then we noticed in Habits of the Mind that Sire quotes this guy all the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I can remember Andy saying he's incredibly quotable.
Mm-hmm. And
that's absolutely true. This is just dripping with quotes. And so I have like dozens of them. I don't even know.
Just pick one.
So this is a good Thinklings themed idea. So this is in his I believe the second larger unit. Or no, it's the first big one is the intellectual vocation. And then the subsection underneath of that, the intellectual has a sacred call, and then the second subheading, the intellectual does not stand alone. And this is on page 12. I really like this quote. As life-giving is solitude, so paralyzing and sterilizing is isolation.
Solitude and isolation.
Yeah, so he's drawn a parallel there.
Usually.
And he's like, it's good to have solitude. And he's going to really exalt solitude in the next big heading, the organization of life. Mm-hmm. He's going to talk about simplifying and having quiet times.
Yeah.
But then he's like, but there's a difference between solitude and isolating yourself. Like you need people. And so from page 12 there, as life-giving is solitude, so paralyzing and sterilizing is isolation. And I wonder if he realized so this was a translation.
Yeah, it's written in French.
So he would not have intentionally rhymed that, but the translator did. And it does kind of roll off the tongue. Paralyzing and sterilizing is isolation. So you'll limit yourself if you isolate yourself.
That's right. If your book gets translated into another language, get a good translator.
Or not, and just let it happen. Anyway, so on that note, we have some Thinklings business to tend to.
Books and business.
Let's talk about some books. And of all the things we talked about before, do you have something that you've been reading or working on?
I've been working on an article on the burnt offering, so I've been reading Leviticus commentaries. I know that's a very great interest of all of our listeners, but
we had some legal reading.
Right. We had some listener feedback, and one of them was concerning Brandon Sanderson's book that I mentioned, The Way of Kings. And John Swedberg actually wrote in and filled in a lot of the gaps, and he said that Sanderson's a Mormon, which kind of explains why his books are a lot cleaner than a lot of the books written today. Some of the books do touch on grown-up themes, and he said he would rate them probably like a PG-13. Anyway, he said the Warbreaker book would be one to steer away from with the kids. I don't know what that means, but I'm probably going to follow his guidance. But we've had a few different people write in about some of the topics we've been communicating recently. And so I want to try to just bring one of those up every once in a while, and particularly some of these duets. So thanks, John, for writing in and filling us in a little bit on Brandon Sanderson and The Way of Kings.
And there was another one that had written in, which was Caleb Lobb, correct? And he had mentioned something about In the House of Bombadil, like a song. And he's like, I don't know if Charlie's heard about this. Yes, Caleb, I have. And but it's nice to have someone remind me of good things. And then he had mentioned that he and his wife are going to read your book, Tim, even though it's not for them.
So this is something I've learned about my book, because it's okay. This is like a publishing.
Do you see how I
like
perfectly placed the ball on the tee for you, and Tim's about ready to smack it?
Well, it just happened. So we were at the Women's Renew conference this last weekend, and our book's title is Song of Songs for Singles. So because it's singles, everybody just assumes it's not going to be anything that's going to help them. Not to mind that we have a lot of mothers there with parents there, and they're raising singles.
Kids who are not currently married.
Exactly, right. And so Ange actually led a session on the importance of teaching the song to the next generation. And it was like a deja vu moment for a lot of moms who are like, oh, this is going to be an important part of the education for my kid. And we're like, yeah. But it just kind of taught me, okay, this is how you get these spinoffs where you get Song of Songs for Singles, Song of Songs for Parents, Song of Songs for Married Couples, Song of Songs for Newly Engaged Girls, or whatever else. You know what I mean? And they do all these different spinoffs, because actually it's not just for marketing. I always attribute it to marketing, but the clientele expects something that's more directly connected to them.
Yeah.
So anyway, it is going to be helpful for you, I pray, Caleb.
Yes. So, and just we'll say again, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to send us an email. And you might not always make it, you plural, so all of our listeners, you might not always make it to the very end of the podcast, but we will remind you that you can always email us, tell us what you're reading, give us a topic suggestion. And in fact, Caleb, I think in his email suggested something to us, which is an Old Testament question, Tim. So might have to have you put your eye on that again. But yeah, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for sending us stuff. And I've got a book that I have finished for the second time, which is like, whoa, you know, how good does a book have to be for you to read it a second time? Well, there's a reason that I read it a second time. It's because I assign it in a class. And what I think I do somewhat uniquely, which it's not unique to me. I'm sure there's been thousands upon thousands of professors over the years that have done things like this. And I know that's to be true because some of these techniques are famously named after some of these individuals. But instead of assigning a textbook and saying, I want you to read this book by November 10th and tell me that you read it, I break a book into sections, you know, a manageable amount of pages, 30, 40-ish. And my students know this semester, every Thursday at 10 a.m., they have a reading assignment due. And along with that reading assignment, they have a writing assignment where they are supposed to critically engage with some of the ideas in that week's reading. And the purpose of the writing assignment is to then come into class and you have like three concrete ideas that you can discuss with your classmates. So they are reading, writing, and rehearsing that information 3 times. And so I like to read what they're reading so that I can be current and kind of know what they're talking about. Like, oh, I don't remember that being in there. And so the book that I've now read for the second time is Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, An Approach to Distinctively Christian Education by Douglas Wilson. And so the book is doing exactly what the title says. He's going to build a case for classical education. And so that's the book I have here. And I think we've maybe talked about this and certainly some portions of it on previous episodes. So if some listener wants to be the sleuth and find out back in 2021 if we talked about this book, If you want to re-listen to some of those and find that and send it to me, it may or may not exist. I don't know. But you can look that up if you'd like.
We've definitely talked about the ideas on multiple occasions.
Yes, because he is building off of some ideas from other people,
Right.
as mentioned in his title. So, but as the book suggests, he appeals for a distinctly Christian education, and we might say he's going to appeal strongly for a distinctly classical education. And as he defines classical education, he would when he defines Christian education, he would highlight that having God as the logical focal point of the universe of a system of education is what ties all of your content together. It's a logical bind as you try to teach a child. Well, why do we do math? Why does chemistry work the way it works? Why did history happen that way? What's the bind of all of those things is a sovereign, holy God who's created, who's in charge, who knows. And so he would build on some of those ideas as a Christian education must have God as its focal point. And also, he's going to highlight heavily that God's word informs the proper goals of education. How could you have a distinctly Christian education that doesn't have goals established in the Word of God? And so, mainly, that children are not cute little bundles of goodness. He thinks it's fundamental to the goal and task of education to recognize the problem of sin, that students will need to work hard to learn, and they won't want to work hard. Students will naturally deviate. They will have problems that will require discipline.
We were talking to a lady in our community, and she mentioned that the homeschool model that she was employing was unschooling. I had never heard of that before.
Interesting.
But it was essentially allowing the child to choose for themselves what they wanted to learn. And it had a lot of, not a lot of direction. Mm-hmm. And it was based upon a philosophy that the child is naturally good, and that the culture itself is what's binding the child and leading them astray. So it's kind of consistent with what you're talking about there.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this a little bit in some of my critique and commendation of the book, but that it really is a cornerstone in the philosophy of public education, specifically in America, but I think you could say in the West, in the modern era, is a very humanist agenda, which as a part of that is that humans are inherently good, or some flavor that way, that we're not depraved. We don't need redeemed. Certainly we don't need a God to die for us. We're okay. And that's where actually the goal of education becomes to make us the most okay we can be, that it's through education that we're saved and delivered from the ills of life. It's not God who does that. It's properly educating the human.
Yeah.
That's what delivers. And Wilson does interact with that. Before we get into that a little bit more, if you didn't catch it in the title, he is referencing something. He embeds a reference in his title, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. The Lost Tools of Learning was a speech, probably also written, so you call it an essay, by a lady named Dorothy Sayers, and it would originally have been delivered at Oxford in 1947. She would have been an inkling. She was cohorts with Tolkien and Lewis and Williams and Barfield and all those dudes. And so really the kernel of that title is this essay that she's recognizing in the 40s that we're not educating the way we might want to. And at the very end of her essay, she talks about that we are living on education capital. Like these ideas and these institutions that we have been building, or that are working out, that we have, are the result of people who were educated in a way drastically different than how we're trying to educate kids today.
And when did she write that about? When did she give that address? 1947. 47. Where can somebody find it?
Well, it's in the appendix of this book. At the Faith Bookstore, is that what we're going for?
No, that was what I wanted. Is in the appendix. It is at the
Yeah.
Faith Bookstore as well.
Yeah. And so you can get a standalone copy of that essay. You can easily find it on the internet. My recommendation would be that Canon Press did revise this book fairly recently. I think
2022, just last
2022,
year.
which was a bummer because I taught the class in 21, and all my students are like, "Where do I find this book?" And then it's like, "Oh, they just redid it." And so all my students this year have nice new copies. And
You've got your old book beat up one?
Yeah, that I got used off of eBay and or I don't even know where I got it, but so I would recommend. I think this book is worth purchasing. You get the Sayers essay at the back, but you also get the book that Wilson's written, and I do think it is something that kind of what we were talking about earlier, where parents, realize that they have a single, that they're raising someone who's single. They might want to buy the book about singles. Well, why am I reading a book about educating kids? I'm a single guy. I don't have kids. Well, what if I have some someday? And I think this has really helped me kind of galvanize some thinking of like, if I did have a kid who was 5 years old, and I'm going to start them down a path of education, what would I do?
Yeah.
What do I see as really important? I think Wilson is actually worth your time there. But anyway, back to Sayers. So that's what she's promoting, is that we are on the shoulders of giants. Some of the educational or philosophical or religious giants of their time had all been classically educated versus modern education, where they were taught a pursuit of learning and a love of learning with God or theology at its core. And modern education has shifted from that to more of a subject kind of fragmented approach. Like, okay, you're going to go to history and you're going to learn history. You're going to go to English, you're going to learn English. It's kind of these disjointed subjects without a focal point to bind them, because there's no God. And what Sayers promotes, which is what Wilson is going to pick up on and say, hey, we need to do this, is we need to return to that. We need to have a Christian, and he would advocate also classical approach to education. And so here's what I really like about the book. I've got 2 points. So I'll preface this by saying I went to public school. And I think I survived.
You're here.
I'm here. Doug Wilson, went to public school. And he talks about his experience in the book. And he has this great quote where he says, "Is the goal of education survival?" Because I feel like a lot of Christians, Today. Well, he's like, a lot of Christians, when we talk about public education, it's like, well, they can survive. And I think he makes a great point. Is survival the goal of education? Like, we kind of like cross our fingers that a Christian teen going to high school makes it, or a public university. Can they make it? And he's going to kind of shift our thinking there. It's like, well, is that like, should that be the goal? Like, well, I hope they survive the Christian school too, but like, isn't there more to it?
To survive the homeschool. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Yikes. And so what I think he does well, and this is from someone who went to public school, didn't realize homeschooling was a thing as big as it was, had no idea what classical education was until about 4 years ago. I think he demonstrates the bankruptcy of the public education system, specifically in America, really well.
Like the model.
The model and what it claims to do and what it has epically failed to do. Where you are... He breaks out statistics that are dated in my copy. I don't know if he revises them, but about how, there's this big focal point on like literacy and how public education just fails to teach people how to read. And that students, we don't have to get into the numbers. I don't have the numbers in front of me because I didn't want to get into the numbers. But I think he demonstrates well that public education has some lofty goals and never gets close. And then on top of that, they recognize that they're not getting close. And then they have their own ideas of how to reform the education system, which are also pretty. You read through them and you're like, yeah, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, we just need more money, you know? Like, well, no, there might be some other issues here. And so I like the way that he presents, like, let's put our eye on public education in America. Is that a way to educate your kids? And he's, well, it's not.
It is a way.
It is a way. Yeah. It's not a good way. It's not, at least in the way he presents it. You can always present data the way you want there. And so I like that. Tim, you looked like you had a thought you wanted to throw in.
Well, so like the goal to teach kids how to read. It's not really to teach them to read. It's to cultivate in them a desire to read. If they want to read, then they will read. And that was something that we kind of learned, and the classical model kind of encourages that. I think it's actually biblical.
Yeah.
It's the principle of Proverbs 1:1-7. And that was kind of a pivotal time in our personal journey in our education model, which was all homeschooled, by the way.
Yeah.
Where a classical model kind of encouraged more the desire and the love for education, as opposed to just, well, they can read sentences and make sense of them.
Well, and he will highlight the affections as an important part of classical education. And so does Sayers in her essay. Like, it's a love of learning, so that if they love how to learn, they'll learn anything.
Right.
What he points out with the reading is more so just the efficacy of their approach. Like, does our modern public education system believe that it's like a look-say method of reading, or is it a phonics-based reading? And they've essentially rejected the model that works for a model that they think is the best, and it's like funneling money into programs, and he gets into that. But so that's kind of where he gets on the whole reading shtick. Is it's like they don't know what they're doing. Like, they think this is the best way. It's not the best way. It's proven not to be the best way, but we just keep pouring millions of dollars into it, and it's failing. And so there's that. It helped me think that through, because I was very positive to public education, in the sense of I enjoyed my high school experience, didn't think there were anything wrong with it, but I also think I had a lot of blessing there that maybe not every public education system has. So there's that.
And a lot of public school teachers have a real love for the kids too. So, we don't want to, diss anybody that's out there really trying to make a difference in the lives of some of these young people.
And that's where it's not like, it might be a broken machine, but there's still great farmers out there, and that's where I think, for them not being Christian, most of them, I had some wonderful teachers that I wish I could go back to and thank. For, I can think of some English teachers who were having me read things and trying to get me to write about things well, and I was just like, I couldn't have cared less, and but partly that's because I was a sinful human, and they had no way to deal with that. In fact, their worldview was that that's not what's wrong. Maybe they're not entertaining enough. So like the model that public school had no answer to a disruptive student, and they never cultivated in me an actual desire to learn. Now, I did it because I wanted to, I was ambitious, wanted to succeed.
No way.
Yeah, So there's again other sinful motivations at play. But so I like how he analyzes public school, and I think as a parent, that's worth your time to consider what his ideas are. Not that you hook, line, sinker what he's saying, but I think it's a good perspective. And I really liked, kind of as the balance to that, is that regardless of if you send your kids to public school, Christian school, classical school, homeschool, I don't know how to say that one, but regardless of how you choose to go about the education of your kids, he has a strong emphasis on whose responsibility is that. Doesn't matter who your teachers are at school. Doesn't matter if it's classical, Christian, public. It is always the parent's job.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he really emphasizes that well. And that's one of the big cornerstone ideas in the class, discipleship of children, is that trying to help us realize if you're discipling another kid, they're not yours. You will never be, with very rare exceptions, the primary discipler of that child. And if we're going to talk about educating a child to understand who the Lord is, to love the Lord, that is an endeavor that is guided and led by a responsible parent, ideally. And so I really like how he emphasizes that. And he has a great illustration at the beginning of one of his chapters to highlight this, where he's like, imagine you have, I'm going to paraphrase it to dramatize a little bit for a podcast. Imagine you have a young child, say 6 or 7 years old, and you and your wife or you and your husband want to go out on a date night. So what are you going to look for? Look for a babysitter. You're just going to pull some random person off the street. Are you going to heavily vet the babysitter of your young child? Probably going to want to know who they are, who are their parents, where are they from, what are their beliefs? Like, are they going to come in and just taint my child? Like, is my child safe here? And now, fast forward, 5 years or so, they're going off to school. Do you vet their teacher the same way you vet the babysitter? And he's like, that's kind of crazy to me. And like, well, hey, Johnny, what'd you learn at school? Oh, who's your teacher? You have no idea. And he's using that in the stream of, man, parents, you want to know who's educating your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we had this discussion in class. So if I was in a position where public education was my only option, I would feel compelled to do a lot of unlearning and relearning. I would want to have a strong pulse on, well, what did this person say today? Or what are you learning in this class? And what do you think about that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Because I know what I was taught in the Christian school or in the public school, and came face to face, front to front with, lies often. And so I think I really like that emphasis of the book, is just the role of the parent. And I think he's very unwavering in that. And not that you can't utilize an effective teacher in any one of the methods, but that it does eventually come back to a parent with oversight.
Mm-hmm. And that's a very biblical theme.
Yeah, right in Deuteronomy 6.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 6. The parents are the ones that are the ultimate one responsible for the education of their child. And in some situations, perhaps public education is the option, in others, Christian, and in others, homeschooling.
Yeah.
But it comes back to the parent being a selfless, sacrificial individual, the husband being the head of the household and guiding and directing and making a decision that's not easy necessarily, but best for his children. I like to put it on the father.
Yes.
But it's a collective decision. But men, you're the husband, you're the father, you're the one that needs to truly be part of this process and involved.
And do we want to get into this, or we want to wait for the next one? Because there's another book.
Well, let's save it for the next one.
Where you've highlighted this book before, friend of the podcast, Scott Annual.
Oh, Let the Little Children Come?
He's going to talk about homeschooling and what's the tendency. I think it's Annual. It might be Wilson, but I think it's Annual. Where it's like, well, what would the tendency be of a father who wants to abdicate his authority with homeschooling? Well, I'll just let my wife do it. And that would be just as wrong as saying, well, we'll let the teacher at the public school do it. Or we'll let the teacher at the Christian school do it.
Well, it's an oversight. So, it's not necessarily that.
For the father specifically is where I was.
Yeah. So the father would then delegate it off to the wife, which is most of the time the scenario. She's the overseer of the house. Yeah. And so that's often the way that it works. But today, my son, Zach, he came with me, and he was with me most of the morning. But that was primarily because Dad's workplace is very quiet and Mom's isn't as much. Sure. And he had a lot of work to do.
Well, highlighting there just the maybe the unaware parent, where, regardless of where they're being educated, you should probably have a decent level of involvement and oversight there as a responsible parent, trying to train your child in the way they should go. So those are the two things I thought the book did well. We're trying to go a little quickly here. We've talked enough about Wilson, but he demonstrates the bankruptcy of the public school system. He's a strong emphasis on the home and the responsibility of the parents to disciple their children. What does he not do well in the book? I don't think he guides a parent well if they don't have a classical Christian option. I think if he was to revise the book, which he did, I would love to see him say, well, okay, how would you navigate through some of these alternatives to what his clear and apparent option is? So what he did is he literally started a school for when his daughter needed it. Like, well, we're not sending them there. We'll just start our own. And that is not the reality for every parent. Like, we'll just start a classical Christian school. And so I think he could present some more practical balance to his ideas. I think he states a balance, but I don't think he practically walks through what that might look like for parents. And so maybe add there, it was written in the 80s. I believe it was in the 80s.
Yeah, it was 80s.
And so some of his statistics on education and education models, reading it in 2021 and 2023, I was like, well, 40 years old. Is there any updates here? What I would anticipate is that the statistics would continue to bear out that the public system might not be as great as we think. And so I would hope in the revised edition he would have some updated statistics for us. And so it's a dated kind of manuscript there. Overall, I do think it's worth reading. I would put this book high on the radar for parents looking to critically think about the education of their children. Not that you have to adopt all of its ideas, because I wouldn't. But I think it would help you think through some ideas well. And that's where in the class we pair it with a couple of other things. When I first inherited the class, it was called Christian Education of Children. And so I did have a very heavy education, like formal education flavor to it.
Yeah.
It has since been renamed to Discipleship of Children, where I think the formal education of a child, which maybe should have some Christian elements in it, falls under the ultimate discipleship of the parent to the child. And so I kept the textbook because I thought it still fit well. As mentioned, a couple other books that are in the same ballpark as far as discipleship of children is concerned. Let the Little Children Come by Scott Annual, and For the Children's Sake, which is her name is Macaulay, but it's that's a homeschool classical kind of a blend in that book. One of my pastors turned me on to that, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm planning to. And so I'm going to rank it. I don't know if I ranked it before, which if someone wants to find if I did somewhere, I will love you till the end of time. I'm going to go with a 4. A 4. I think it is good. I don't think it's like, break the bank, order it tonight, you have to read it. So it's not a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But I do think it is a solid book for you. And I'm going to put this at the end because I was just talking to someone the other day, and they were like, it's really funny when someone references a book or an author, and the first thing they say is, well, you have to be aware that they're reformed or whatever. So I'm going to say this last. He is very consistent. Now, I believe Doug Wilson is a post-millennial.
Yes.
Which means Christ does not come and set up his kingdom pre-millennial. Christ comes back at the post of the millennium. So who builds the kingdom? Christians. And so why would Doug Wilson be really excited about education reform? He's consistent with his theology. And there is a statement that he makes towards the end of the book where it's very blatant that we do this as a part of the kingdom. And so I didn't say it at the front, I said it at the end. Just be careful when you read it because he's a little different theologically. Anyway, do you have any other thoughts there, Tim, before we close with a final meditation in God's Word?
Nope, I thought that was a really good caveat. And whether it's at the end or the beginning,
as long as it's there.
Way to vary it up.
I don't know if that person will listen to this, but I was getting coffee with someone recently, and I just think it's funny when we're like, oh yeah, Doug Wilson, you gotta be careful. So Put it at the end.
The reason we always say that we're careful around Wilson because there's a lot of stuff that we like about him, but then there's that.
Yeah.
So Proverbs chapter 30. I've been working through Proverbs 30 on the podcast, and today I'm going to continue. We're going to be looking at verses 10 through 17. So we're looking at two sections here. The first section, verses 10 through 14, do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you, and you be held guilty. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. There are those who are clean in their own eyes, but are not washed of their filth. There are those who, how lofty are their eyes, how high their eyelids lift. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among mankind. Okay, so this is the 4 verses. The text starts out with this proverb, do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you and you be held guilty. There's some question on whether or not that verse specifically goes with the section before or the section after, because 11 through 14 is a clear unit. You may have noticed at the beginning, as I was reading, there are those who. Each verse begins with, there are those who. Well, I guess verse 13 is different. But the reason that it is structured that way is because in the Hebrew, you technically have a generation. And the word generation begins verse 11, 12, 13, and 14. It's a specific literary device called an anaphora. So it marks 11 through 14 off as a clear structural unit. That then leaves verse 10. What in the world is it doing? And it's quite likely functioning as an inclusio with the end of Proverbs 30 and the Proverbs of Ugur, where he's basically advocating for people to live in contentment in the situation in which God has placed them, which I find kind of fascinating because I know of a New Testament guy that said that quite a bit as well, the Apostle Paul. If you find yourself, you're saved in a specific situation, you don't need to change that. Live a Christian life in the situation in which God has placed you. So he's not advocating for any kind of laziness, but instead is just like, if you're striving to put yourself in a better situation or whatever, then you're going to end up hurting other people. So what do we have then in verse 10? Verse 10, do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you and you be held guilty. It's an interesting proverb, slandering a servant to the master. So several people believe this might be like a slavery type of a situation. In the Old Testament, by the way, for its ancient worldview, was very anti-slavery. I know a lot of times the apologetics people don't agree with that kind of a statement because there is slavery in the Old Testament. But if a person flees from their master, the Jewish person was supposed to take that person and not return them to their master. And so it was really a very anti-slavery law code for the culture in which it was written. So do not slander a servant to his master. Otherwise, what's going to happen? Well, the servant is the slave, by the way. It's really probably better a slave. The slave is going to be like cursing that individual. And to whom does an individual appeal to for a curse? Who would a person, if you're going to curse somebody, to whom would you appeal?
God.
Yes.
One for one.
One for one, man.
If Andy's usually here with me, and we can like stare at each other and be like,
I know, you're stuck.
Go, man.
You would curse him in the name of the Lord.
Yes.
And then what's the last statement say?
And you be held guilty.
You be held guilty by whom?
God.
God. Exactly.
2 for 2.
2 for 2, man. It's like the Sunday school answer.
Yeah, can't go wrong.
I can't go wrong. So the statement is very anti-slavery type of a message. In fact, if a slave is in a whatever type of a situation and you're slandering him to the master, putting that slave then in a worse situation, he may appeal to God, and then guess what God might do to you? If you're found guilty, then God's going to whack you, the rich person. Okay, do you see how this proverb is portrayed from a rich person's perspective? So as this text begins discussing the rich, It continues therein. So now the 4 generations seem to have this connotation, this flavor, this exhortation against the person who is wealthy. This builds off of what we saw in the previous section. I know it's a week ago or whatever, but we discussed, remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me. That was verse 8. Lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Well, what does the rich person say? They speak a lie. And what is the lie? They deny the existence of God. What do we see in verses 11 through 14? We see the life of the rich person who's basically rejecting, denying the existence of God and living a selfish, greedy life. So what do we have? The first group, verse 11, there are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. Okay, so this is a very foundational concept, a very beginning of life type of a concept, where the cursing, by the way, is a catchword back to verse 10. They're cursing their fathers and they're not blessing their mothers. That's what these individuals, the father and the mother, were the ones that provided for you when you could not provide for yourself. You should bless them. You should thank the Lord for them. Instead, these people, they just want their parents to be dead, so then they can take the inheritance and live life the way that they want to live. And as they look at themselves, what do they think of themselves? Verse 12, there are those who are clean in their own eyes, but they are not washed of their filth. The word for filth there is like refuse, like dung. And so this idea of cleanliness is a ritual cleanliness. And as they look at themselves, they look pure and holy and good and everything's great. But actually what the reality of their lives are is that they're covered in excrement. I mean, think like, poop. That's what the idea here is of that word. And so they have this false estimation of themselves. So first, they're cursing their parents. Second, they have this false estimation of themselves and that they are holy and good and pure. And then third, there are those who are lofty. How lofty are their eyes? How high their eyelids lift. This is a very exalted they have a very exalted view of themselves. Not only are their eyes lifted up, but their eyelids are lifted up. And the word there may be the pupils. It's like the focal point of the eyes. They just are so full of themselves. They have it all figured out. They are the ones that are wealthy. They're in control. They deny the existence of God. They don't care about other people. And they are simply consuming those around them for their own personal benefit. And that's the last proverb, or the last anaphora in verse 14. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives. This is disgusting. To devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among mankind. So imagine a poor individual and they're on the earth. They are pictured as being a mouth and consuming the poor. They are removing the needy from among mankind. It's like, man, there aren't many poor people around here. Yeah, that's right. There aren't many poor people. You know why? Because we're wiping them out all the time. That's why there aren't any poor people here. And that's what these people are. They're just full of themselves. There's no fear of God in their lives, and they are simply consuming. That leads to the next Proverbs. It's not an anaphora this time in verses 15 through 17, but we do have some number parallelism. I'm now going to read verses 15 to 17. The leech has 2 daughters, give and give. 3 things are never satisfied, 4 never say enough. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by the vultures. Okay, so now what is the theme of this passage? Well, we have a leech. Wouldn't it be nice to be known? Yeah, I'm a leech. Well, what is a leech? What does a leech do?
Sucks blood.
Sucks blood. That's right. It's just like more. All right. Now, the leech here is identified as what type of an individual? The leech has 2 daughters. So thus, what is the leech?
Parent.
A parent, exactly. And the leech is feminine, so this would be the mother.
Interesting.
So if you're a leech and you're always more, gimme, guess what you're going to have for a daughter? The leech has 2 daughters. Give and give. Just as the mother, so also the daughter. And so there's probably a little exhortation
That's
there.
cute.
Isn't that cute?
Like mother, like daughter.
Like mother, like daughter. Yeah. And they're just constantly wanting more and more and more. 3 things are never satisfied. You can see the theme now in this, I think it's called an epigram of 3 things are never satisfied, 4 never say enough. And the 4 things, this is kind of odd, but you have Sheol, that'd be the grave, the barren womb, so the woman who cannot conceive, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. Fire just keeps burning. It never stops, just keeps burning and burning and burning. Then the text ends in verse 17. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by the vultures, which is gross. So the eye is going to be plucked out by the bird, by the vulture, and fed to the offspring of the vulture. There's a lot of stuff here. First, the eye. The eye is the organ of desire. You see something and then what?
You want it.
You want it.
Man, I'm doing so good
you
today.
You are doing awesome. Keep it up. We're almost there. You're going to go perfect. Okay. Verse 15. What did we have? The leech has 2 daughters. Give and give. Mine, mine, mine. What do we have at the end in verse 17? The organ of desire. I want. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother. But at the beginning of our section, we have a daughter. Now here we have a son. And what happens to that eye? It will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by the vultures. It says vultures there, but it's literally the sons of the vultures. It's literally the word for son. It means the offspring, the children, the babies, because it's connecting to the daughter, where the daughter says give and give. Here you have the bird, the offspring, the child, consuming the eye of the covetous individual who is not satisfied with the provision of God. This connects back to the idea that Agur stated in his 2 things I ask, deny them not before I die. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me. Contentment. Be content with the blessing with which God has given you. Don't be like the rich fool who's just devouring and devouring and devouring. Don't be like the leech. Don't be like the young man that just wants and wants and wants, and mocking the father and scorning the obedience of the mother. But just be content. Look around yourself as you go through a time of trial, as you go through a time of bounty. Look around and just say, thank you. Thank you, Lord, for this blessing that you have given to me. Praise him for it. Say a prayer, and then pray for those who are less fortunate than yourself. Think, if God is blessed, how might I give? Instead of taking, how might I give to those who have less? And then just wait and see how God provides.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast. The Thinklings want to remind our listeners that the Thinklings podcast is our personal production. Our conversations, book discussions, and viewpoints may not represent the views of Faith Baptist Bible College and Theological Seminary. Any questions or feedback should be directed to us at the Thinklings podcast.